Hi, my name is Eesha Parasnis. I am a senior majoring in biopsychology, cognition, and neuroscience at the Center for Academic Innovation. So, the agenda for this presentation is I'm going to give a brief overview of my project and also some background information. Then, I'm going to talk about the process, followed by the next steps that we'd like to take. And I'm going to conclude by talking some of the challenges I faced and some of my biggest takeaways. So let's jump right into it. This was the first project I worked on as an academic innovation fellow, and my goal was to design a behavioral intervention using classroom assessment techniques, for example, muddiest point or minute paper on ECoach. So I know that sounds like a lot of complicated jargon, so let me break it down for you. ECoach is a personalized learning platform built by the Center for Academic Innovation, and it helps students with setting goals for study plans, tracking progress and grades, and receiving feedback on ways to improve performance. So, this was the platform on which my team wanted to implement the behavioral intervention. This brings me to my next term, behavioral intervention. A behavioral intervention is a way to modify a person's behavior. In this case, we wanted to modify students' behaviors when studying or reviewing course content, and we wanted to do this through cats. Now, by cats, I don't mean everyone's favorite furry animals, I mean classroom assessment techniques, which are techniques used in the classroom by instructors to evaluate different aspects of student learning and comprehension. For this intervention, we were debating between two classroom assessment techniques, the muddiest point and the minute paper. So the muddiest point assesses metacognition, that is, thinking about thinking. So at the end of every class meeting, an instructor might ask students to answer the following question: what is the muddiest topic from this week's lectures to you? And the muddiest topic refers to the concepts students found the most difficult to comprehend. This gets students to think about what they know versus don't know and gives instructors an idea of students' understanding of the material. The minute paper gets students to reflect on course content and or to improve retention. In this case, instructors will give students a minute, hence the name, to answer a combination of some of the questions, such as what was your main takeaway from this week's lectures? What questions still remain unanswered? Summarize the most surprising thing you learned this week. So this gets students to reflect on what they learned over the course of a week and also helps retain the information. So I hope by now the goal, which is to design a behavioral intervention using classroom assessment techniques such as muddiest point or minute paper on ECoach, is a little less confusing. I also want to point out that these classroom assessment techniques are typically conducted in the classroom using pen and paper, whereas what we're trying to do is do this digitally through ECoach, which is why what we're trying to do is very new and different from what has been done before. Um, so what I had to do was first decide which classroom assessment technique should be used to implement the behavioral intervention, and then plan the logistics of the behavioral intervention. So as someone who had just started working with the behavioral science team, I had a lot of catching up to do myself. So I started with literature reviews, and I did this to familiarize myself with the muddiest point and the minute paper, and also to identify key findings from existing research on muddiest point and minute paper, and also behavioral interventions implemented using technology versus traditional pen and paper. I then conducted student interviews to gain insights into students' perceptions of the muddiest point and the minute paper, and also to gain insights into students' preferences for intervention specific features. For example, if we were to contact students, would they prefer to be contacted via text or via email? How often would they like to participate in the intervention? And these answers would then help me decide the logistics of the intervention. I then summarized my research and findings and came up with a list of ideas and recommendations for the intervention, as well as how this intervention will be researched. I shared my findings and recommendations at a team discussion, and we ultimately came up with the intervention design. Throughout this process, I made sure to periodically check in with my supervisor to get her feedback and to ensure that I was on the right track. So during the team discussion, we discussed some of the logistics of the intervention. So, for example, what is the goal of the intervention? Is it to improve metacognition or retention or both? And then, based on that, which classroom assessment technique should be used? Just the muddiest point, just the minute paper, or both? What should be the experimental versus control groups? How many coaches or classes should be included in this intervention? How should the questions be worded? So these were some of the logistics that we discussed. And then some of the features that we discussed were how should the students be notified? How often should the students be notified? And I already had some of the answers to these questions from my student interviews. So we also discussed these answers during the team discussion and used those to come up with our final product. So, the research questions that we wanted to answer by studying this intervention were um, first, is this intervention beneficial to students' retention and metacognition? Is it having a positive impact on students as we hope? Is one classroom assessment technique more effective than the other? Is the muddiest point more effective than the minute paper or vice versa? Then we would see, which student types respond best to which classroom assessment technique. Do some students, for example, highly motivated students respond better to these techniques, or do, students who don't perform well in classes, do they benefit from these classroom assessment techniques more than other students? And lastly, does one classroom assessment technique work better for certain classes than for others? Does the course format or the course content play a role in how effective a classroom assessment technique is? And we hope that some of the answers to these questions can also be then used to personalize the intervention for future students. So the research design that we ultimately decided on was to study this intervention. We'll have three groups: a muddiest point group and a minute paper group. These two are the experimental groups, and then a control group. Um, the intervention has been implemented for winter 2020 in EECS 183, Stats 250, Engineering 101, and Physics 140 for extra credit. So that's the incentive for participating in this intervention. Um, Students have to answer the question that they're assigned to based on whatever group that they're in 75% of the times leading up to exam one to receive full extra credit. So I want to clarify that 75% of the times may look different for EECS 183 and Stats 250, because maybe EECS 183 has 6 weeks leading up to exam one, but Stats 250 has 5. So the amount of times that students will participate in the intervention will vary per class, but we set 75% as a number because we wanted to make sure that we're getting enough responses to go off on. And so the intervention questions are: if you're in the muddiest point group, every week you would answer which topic is least clear from whatever course you've been assigned for this intervention for that week. And then for the minute paper, every week you would answer what were your main takeaways from whatever course you've been assigned to for the intervention. And for the control group, we had to make sure that we also asked the control group a question, because the other two groups are answering questions, but the question did not have to relate to either of the classroom assessment techniques. So my supervisor has always wanted to track students' moods and emotions over the course of a semester, which is why we thought that including the question, how have you felt over the last week, was a fun way of doing that. So the minimum viable product that we eventually decided on was students will opt into the intervention through an email after completing the beginning of semester survey. Students will then specify a day and time that they want to answer the question every week leading up to exam one. And of course, students can change their preferences throughout the course of the intervention. Students will receive a weekly email with the intervention question based on whatever group that they're assigned to at the day and time that they specify. Students also have the option to either continue or opt out after exam one, but for those students who decide to continue, they will not receive any additional extra credit. Um, Instructors will receive a basic report so that they can keep track of what responses that students are turning in, and also students will be able to view their responses in chronological order. So the next steps that we want to do are, first, of course, analyze the data that has been collected over the course of the winter 2020 semester, just to see, are we able to answer any of our research questions, are any concerns coming up, has our hypothesis been tested, like that this is actually beneficial to students' metacognition and retention. Of course, due to the unfortunate circumstances caused by the coronavirus, we're not really sure how that could have affected the results of the data. And so we're still trying to decide how to ultimately analyze the data. We'd also like to conduct usability tests with students just to gain some feedback on the interface. Did students find it easy to navigate? Did any functionality issues come up? Just to fine tune the interface for future students. We'd also like to conduct student and instructor interviews to gain in-depth insights. Of course, we'd love to hear about students' feedback on what they thought of the intervention. Was it interesting? Was it tedious? Did they feel like it was useless? And what was their impression of doing this? Did they notice any changes themselves? And of course, ask instructors, how are they going to use this data? How are they going to change their teaching style or the course content based on the data that they receive? How often are they going to be responsive to this data, etc.? And of course, if the data suggests that this was a successful intervention, we'd love to implement it again in future semesters and hopefully build out some of the dream features that we were unable to do so for this term. So some of the challenges I faced when working on this project was, one, literature reviews can get very overwhelming. I was reading academic papers and articles and blog posts for almost 3 weeks, and by the end, my brain was definitely fried. So that was definitely a little challenging, staying focused on tons and tons of papers. Another challenge was that there isn't a lot of existing research on this type of behavioral intervention. As I mentioned before, these classroom assessment techniques are traditionally done on pen and paper, and no one has done this in a digital format. So there wasn't a lot of background research that I could, jump off of. So I had to improvise and make judgment calls a lot, which was very intimidating, especially as a new fellow, but was also part of the fun. And since I was new to the team, there was a steep learning curve, and I had to adjust to, the team and the work, and also had to learn very quickly and independently. So that was a little challenging. My main takeaways was, first, it was super exciting for me to try something new that one has not been done before in terms of academic innovation or just the ed tech industry, but also in terms of my work. I had not had any previous experience with behavioral interventions before, so it was very exciting for me to work on such an innovative, challenging project so early on at my time. So early on in my time at academic innovation. It definitely challenged me to think out of the box when making decisions and judgments, but I also, really enjoyed the creative freedom I got, and it really taught me how to be firm and take a stand. And, it's okay if you make mistakes. We're just trying to figure it out, and we'll make adjustments along the way. But it's good to always have some kind of opinion and to share that opinion. And lastly, I learned so much during the process, not only about conducting literature reviews, but also how to synthesize and summarize technical information and how to present that to a team and how to collaborate with stakeholders when making important decisions, and also how to constantly problem solve in case of any setbacks. So this overall was just such an enriching and exciting project to work on, which is why I wanted to share this at the AI showcase. So that's it for me. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to me at my email, which is eeshap@umich.edu. Thank you very much.